Hi, everyone, and welcome to Conversations, a Women's Congress for Future Generations project. Today, we're speaking with Megan Sheridan. Megan is a consultant primarily working on how humans work together for shared purposes. Megan was most recently a core team member at I Matter Youth, where she facilitated the formation of a purpose-driven, self-organizing team structure. She is currently recovering from having to close the doors on the last iteration of I Matter at the end of this past summer and ruminating on how she believes change can happen in the world. Megan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so if you just wanted to let us know, what are you working on right now these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question to answer, particularly as a slightly older millennial, and having been conditioned in the world to be like, what I'm working on is what my job is and what I get paid to do. So yeah, having a lot of feelings about that. So the answer to that question is I'm consulting. I'm working on a small project with a law firm, helping them smooth out some of their systems. And I'm also doing a lot of recovering. I had a hard, pretty stressful past year with the last organization that I was working with, and an incredibly stressful end to my time with that organization. I'm like cleaning my house and making art and spending time with my new nephew, really trying to find my ground again.
So tell us a little bit about the last year.
Would be hard to talk about the last year without also talking about the last 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So about 4 years ago, I started working for an organization called I Matter Youth. And it's interesting things that I've learned about myself, and that are maybe a little less clear cut than like Megan is like a program director, right? Or certain job titles.
Mm-hmm.
But like one of my gifts in the world is really being able to see and know what's stuck in a given situation. And so about 4 years ago, I was hired to do some writing work for I Matter, writing mission, vision, values. And it quickly became clear to me that there was a difference in theory of change between the executive director and one of the founders who was still working with the organization at that time. Part of also who I am in the world was like, oh, I can fix it. I'll fix that. I'll bridge that gap. And so I've spent a lot of the last 4 years trying to bridge that gap, and trying to make something work that I think really in my heart of hearts, I knew it wasn't sort of reconcilable in the format and in the setup of the organization as it was. So I did a lot of things over the last 4 years. First started working mostly on marketing, and then moved into program development, and then did a lot of, particularly as the organization was growing, a setup of the structure of how we worked together, particularly as a remote organization, and doing a lot of support of the staff. So, yes, that's what I was doing. Mm-hmm. What happened, and why it had such a hard ending, is some of those differences that I was talking about sort of came to a head in a very public way this past spring, with an effort here in Minnesota called Minnesota Can't Wait. That was a group of students from I Matter, and other like Climate Generation and people who worked with the PowerShift Network, and the Line 3 interveners all sort of come together under one banner. And part of what was happening in the in how some of those core tensions that I talked about, right? This difference in theory of change, that there was something about that project, the timing, that sort of turned it into this pressure cooker. And at the end, that there were actually quite a lot of young people who were hurt, who felt like their voices weren't included, who felt like their communities weren't included, particularly young folks of color. And it was incredibly sad and frustrating for these young folks. And I think that's always been that's been at this core challenge, which is not unique to iMatter, certainly not unique to the youth climate movement, and I think a big moral question around how we get to change, right? It's like a means versus ends, and that there can be a tendency in some, there's a whole section of the climate movement that believes we have to get to a certain parts per million at all costs. And another group that believes that how we get there matters. And if the path means harm and more harm to communities that have traditionally been most harmed, that's actually not okay. And so I would say that was the sort of the core tension. And I think, I don't know. I don't know if you have questions. I could probably ramble on about that forever, but
so
or you want me to get more specific?
Well, I'm just thinking, between this specific instance and how this really just plays into the greater environmental movement, which is something that has constantly been problematic and moving forward. So if you just want to, I don't know if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. And I'll mention here, you and I talked about this, that this is the first time I'm really talking about this in a setting beyond, like a private one-to-one conversation. So if I sound like I'm trying to choose my words or not super clear, like, please feel free to push back and be like, can you be more clear?
No problem.
I am a little anxious about sharing some of these stories in this way. So. Okay, so your question is about the broader environmental movement. The situation with Minnesota Can't Wait is not unique. It's not unique to the youth climate movement, and it's I think one of the core things that I believe about the world is that it's in fractals, and that the micro is the macro. And that what happens here in whose voices are included and whose aren't is a microcosm of what's happening in the broader environmental movement and in our broader sort of societal setup. And it's, I think, part of what, this tension between the world is coming to an end, we only have 12 years, that sort of urgency with, who gets run over in the name of urgency, whose injustices need to be pushed off so that other things can happen first. Priorities that are predominantly set by the humans who have dominated this system and who have most benefited from the current system. And I think also that tension between, preserving an existing system and letting something die that is toxic and harmful to the earth and to humans. And so these are some of the big questions that I felt tensions with in my work with iMatter, and that I just still feel tensions with and have questions about, in my lifetime, what are the things that I want to work on and start, knowing that I likely will not see those changes come to life.
So in talking about you no longer work for iMatter and it exists in a different form than it used to, can you tell us a little bit about that breakdown? Like is there still work being done? Anything you can, any insight you can give us?
I can't speak to work that's being done. I am
Gotcha.
not no longer involved.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think nonprofits are particularly challenging, mostly because they exist within these systems. And there's a lot of sort of contorting that has to happen in order to get people, foundations, and individuals to fund something. And yeah, it feels like this crazy sort of where we're all kind of stuck in that the one thing that wants to change the other thing relies on the other thing in order to fund its work. And that's hard. That's a hard setup. And it's, I carry a lot of privileges in the world. I live in a white body, come from economic privilege backgrounds. And I'm also in a position where I can't not have a paycheck. And so I get the tension. And it's one of the questions I have about my life is how to survive a system while building something different. What does that look like? Yeah. And I think that's a core tension is that there are folks in the environmental movement in particular that want to preserve this system, and that the solutions being put forth and advocated for and funded behind are about preserving a system. And my sense is that the system is oppressive and painful, and that we're all harmed. There are folks who are harmed more, and like our humanity is uniquely and inextricably tied to the people who are hurt, so it hurts us too. And those became irreconcilable differences.
So do you think that, this is obviously a system-wide problem. And it's, like you said, it's not unique to environmental nonprofits or nonprofits in general. So do you think that you would ever go back into working in the environmental nonprofit field?
I don't know. My very first job out of college was working at a nonprofit. And there were a number of challenging things there, but up to and including being sexually harassed by the executive director, and I brought my concerns through the proper channels, and then they told him about it, and he confronted me, and then nothing was ever done. And so that was my very first experience with nonprofits, and I was like, why do I do this? Why would I do this? It's the same system, and I'm expected to work more and get paid less, and to be harmed in the workplace. And so I left that place in my early 20s being like, I will never work at nonprofits again. And then I came back. And so I think, like we were talking about earlier, my 24-year-old self would not imagine that my 27-year-old self would have gone back into that. And I did. And so I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. And I think, one of the other topics that often comes up when I'm speaking with people who work for nonprofits is the whole other, issue of mental health and working for nonprofits and in the environmental field. It's difficult. And because of all of the things that you're expected to do in a nonprofit, varying sizes. So if it's a small nonprofit, you're generally wearing multiple hats and carrying multiple roles. And I feel that it's very common for people in this line of work to experience a lot of burnout. Mm-hmm. and trying to move forward from that. And I feel like with your experience and how just this breakdown was so disappointing, because obviously you really were passionate about the work that you were really trying to do and advocate for these young people. I imagine that this transition has been difficult for you, just kind of because there's a letdown, and you feel like, you feel like disappointed in the work and discouraged. How have you been dealing with that?
Yeah. Well, so you have just totally hit on a topic that I could talk about forever. So I think there is burnout, and I think there are certain kind of humans who I sort of generally refer to as healers, who are called into this kind of work. They feel called into healing the world, and that the folks who are so sensitive to the ailments of the world are also like it's almost like we don't have the same filters and feel the pain of the world so much more deeply. So I think already prone to mental illness in particular. Mental illness is something that has been a part of my life always.
Same here. So this is why this is so important to me too, to talk about, because it's not really addressed as much as I think it needs to be. So I'm excited for you to share whatever you can share with us.
All right, let's dive in. This is actually something I've had a lot of chance to talk about and feel much more comfortable talking about. Let's see, it was about 3 years ago now. So it had been about a year of working at iMatter, and right after the 2016 elections, was diagnosed with anorexia and had to go into an intensive outpatient treatment program here in Minnesota. And it was a really, I think, sort of stark moment in my life. At the time, what was I, like 28, 29, like a grown up with bills and responsibilities, and to be confronted with this diagnosis and the necessary treatment being that I needed to like stop my grown up life, and go, it was 6 weeks of all day, every day treatment. And so I decided to take a leave of absence from the work. And so shut down my email, turned off Slack, wasn't communicating with anyone. I was not working. My full-time job was finding my way back to health. And so iMatter, we work with young people, and I will say primarily young women, and non-binary folks. And so I had shut everything down and was walking away from work to take this space to heal myself. And I walk into treatment on the first day, and it's a bunch of these young women, young non-binary folks who are, a bunch of them were on vegan diets because they were prepared to save the world, at the expense of their own. Literally, eating disorders is the most deadly mental illness. It's incredibly hard on your body. And so it was this, I'm like, I don't know what the universe is trying to tell me, but I've like totally decided that I'm, not going to be at work. I'm not going to be a super empath absorbing everyone's issues. And then I walk into this room and I'm like, oh my God, these are the same humans that iMatter serves. And so I've had this interesting relationship. And, the more that I've talked about my experience, the more of the young folks who I've worked with have come forward and told me about their own experiences with eating disorders, and eating disorders in particular, and mental illness in general. And I think it was always one of the things that got really hard for me. There's like my personal, I try to take everything on for everybody. I don't want anybody to ever be hurt, which of course is all at my own expense, and doesn't really do anyone any good. But don't worry, I'm working on that in therapy. But the amount that we ask of these young people and the culture of burnout that's created and upheld by adults, particularly with their minors. There's something about the starkness of that was so hard for me. And I never wanted to push. I never wanted, if someone was tired or not feeling well or sad, like my first response is like, great, don't go to that protest today. Or like, let's have a conversation. Would it be helpful to be with others and to be in community? Or is it that you need to sleep or have a snack? And so, which is always, sort of, then you're kind of like bordering on the line of therapist, which is also super unhelpful. But it's so pervasive. And I think something about healers and people who struggle with mental illness, like I can feel it from them. Like if I'm at a protest or at a meeting, like I can just feel the unwellness kind of vibing off of people, and have really started to see in a lot of folks that activism becomes a form of addiction. It's a thing that we can't not do. And I really struggled with, what's my role in participating in creating a culture that leads to this kind of unwellness and burnout. That's a long story, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate that. And kind of touching on one of your points and all of the things that we ask of young people, just kind of what strikes me lately is all of the memes and the quotes being thrown out there of, we're just kids, like we want to not worry about these things. We want to just be, play a sport or whatever, and not think about how the whole world as we know it is going to end. It's been really interesting to think about that, and to think about, for my own life and my own path going forward. I have to think very carefully about places that I'm going to work for, and what I can take on and what is too much, just because I am someone who just will keep committing themselves to death to do everything and, be involved and help. And it's just thinking about how someone can really be successful long-term in this role. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Because often the people who feel drawn to this work are the ones who feel too much, and then they take on too much and they're burnt out, and it's a really vicious cycle.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And that's where I think that dynamic that it then interacts with the systems of oppression and capitalism that can be so toxic. It can be just so toxic.
So what has all of this experience, like all of these experiences with nonprofits and, things that worked and things that didn't work, what has this kind of, or what do you feel like this has been teaching you for how you're moving forward?
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I took a job, just for a normal job right after everything sort of fell apart. And I had in my head, I'm like, this is a recovery job. I'm going to go to work and I'm going to punch in the numbers and do the thing. And it was interesting to me there. There became a weird dynamic. I was there at a weird time and ended up being like bullied. It was so weird. It was such a weird experience, like something I hadn't actually felt since like middle school. And one of the things I'm taking with me is like, I was clear to leadership about what was happening and that it wasn't okay and I needed support. And then it became very clear to me that they didn't have intention of addressing it. And so I left. And it was the first time in my life that I had been hurt. It was painful. And it became clear to me that there wasn't a path for resolution that didn't involve a hell of a lot more suffering for me. And so I left and immediately felt better. And so I think, one of the things that I'm learning is, I can't do this by myself. And that, whatever that sort of mentality of wanting to protect people, and like, quite honestly, the addictive tendencies of like doing more, doing the next thing, taking it on, is, oh my gosh, I just lost my train of thought. Okay. Lessons. When it becomes clear that people don't intend to change behavior and that behavior is harmful, it's not my job to fix them or to change their minds. And I actually can't. And I think that was probably my biggest lesson from iMatter, and something that I felt in my body. Oh my gosh, by this spring, I had a migraine for like 2 months. And so like this, like physically manifesting. And I kept thinking that it was my job to fix this, to save this, to stop the harm. And when in reality, if I look back, it was probably really my job to walk away, because it wasn't something that I could fix, particularly not alone. So the other thing I'm interested in is how we build strong community, how we build systems of community, outside of the systems that demand individualization, because I think that's part of what I've been raised to believe, is that it's my job to do these things alone. So that feels like a big learning. I quite honestly, I'm probably 99% believe that systems can't be changed from within. I think I'm landing there, as I think about my own. I think it's possible to do harm reduction, but I think the kind of visions that I had for how this collective of humans would work together at iMatter was perhaps a little naive. What else am I learning? It is interesting to take a breath from the climate movement. You're so steeped in the urgency of it every single day. And to like step back for a second and like fall into some actual rhythms of like light and dark of each day and the moon, and taking time to plant bulbs for the spring. Like I find myself a little bit more grounded. And so I think one thing that I want to take with me, and maybe this is part of growing up too, but I always wanted to fix things, and like I wouldn't stop until I could fix it, which I think is part of what leads to the burnout. is this like urgency to fix, and really knowing that there's these things, this the like pervasive patriarchy, the lack of consent in the world, is those things won't be fixed. Those aren't things that I can fix, but they are things that I can work on and plant seeds for. And so I think the other piece is like now being on the other side and like not having a migraine is like, oh my gosh, I don't want to live my life with a migraine.
Right.
I don't want that. So yeah, lots of lessons, lots and lots of lessons.
And one thing that you mentioned that I just kind of wanted to touch back on was you said that the way you went about it or went into this work might have been a bit naive. And I was just thinking, like, how sad that is that you learn that you're naive. You know what I mean? It's because I don't think that it's you're naive. You go in with a sense of purpose and hope, and to join a team of people who are going to be as supportive as their mission and vision. But I understand exactly what you're saying. Through your listening to your experiences, I can feel them mirror my own. And I feel that that's really sad that is what we will look at that and say, oh, well, we were naive. Well, no, it shouldn't be like that. But that's the construct of the world right now, of we're being naive.
Yeah.
You said that and it just kind of rang through my head. Like, that's so disappointing.
Well, and maybe that's more it, like you were talking about before, is that it was so disappointing.
Yeah.
And I think that, so disappointing. And also like the learning that I took, right? And so then approaching this quote unquote regular job that I was doing is like, oh, I know what happens when people say one thing and behave another way. I know what happens, and it's not my intent to expose myself to suffering over this.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I have, and it's not one that I could honestly answer myself, so just preface that with that information. I think that, there are so many people, and myself included, I have had jobs that I have kept for far too long that have been very toxic to me, to my health, just a really bad environment to be in, whether it was nonprofit or for profit, it didn't matter. And I kept them because I don't have any kind of economic privilege to fall back on. I have family and they would do for me what they could, but they certainly weren't jobs that I could quit until I had something else lined up. And, thinking back to how miserable I was, I still, like you said, I carry privilege in the world. So looking to young people today and knowing that they're suffering and they don't really have the option, to say, oh, well, I'll just leave if I'm, being treated unfairly. What's something that you feel you could tell them?
Oh, that's so hard. Again, I think we all carry different overlapping identities. And depending on the identities that we carry, right, it's more or less risky. One of the reasons that I, so it got to a point last spring where I needed to ask the executive director of iMatter to leave. And that was probably one of the scariest Zoom calls of my life. And it was also something that clicked for me. was I can come onto this call and he can fire me if that's what he chooses to do, and I will be okay. It will be hard and I'll have to piece things together, but I have networks and connections and can go get another job and I will be okay. And it's part of what then became clear to me is that really acknowledging those privileges that I carry also then turns into a responsibility. That because I can be okay, it's now my responsibility to do the thing that needs to be done. And you know, I'm safe in my body. You know, again, like economically, it would be hard, but not impossible. And yeah, and so it took a real kind of hard look at the privileges that I do carry, and how to lean into the gifts that I've been given in service of others. Because I would say was the only person on the team who had that luxury. And that then became my responsibility. And same with this last job that I left, this sort of in between one, was part of the privilege I carry in the world is not having to suffer like that. And so how can I leverage that privilege that I carry in service of creating a better space for others who maybe don't have that privilege? And so I think, I don't know, what would I say to a young person? I think it would certainly depend on their, you know, on the position that they're in, but depending on, I mean, one of the gifts that I have is parents who are fierce attorneys. And so depending on what's happening, right, you know, could I offer to marshal some of my, some of the resources that I have available to me in service of, you know, helping people through that. You know, like even the sort of sexual harassment stuff that has happened to me, like being able to have attorneys to talk with, and to have on my side is one of the gifts I carry. You know, and I think, I don't know, maybe I'm shifting out of, I'm definitely in a like real phase where I feel like I'm growing up in a lot of ways. Because when you ask that question, and maybe this is still some stuff to work through, I'm like, well, it's our job to make things better.
Right. I mean, because it is, but then, you know, there's a difference between what you can do as an individual to help them and then what we can do, you know, as a collective group of allies, you know.
I think the other thing that I'm, you know, and having, this was a real challenge for me with working with young women in particular, is that like I can't do their work for them, and I cannot protect them from this world, and that the world is going to hurt them. And I think that was part of, like with I Matter, where like, yes, they are going to be hurt by the world. And no, I will not be a part of an organization that does harm, without then acknowledging and making reparations for harm. That's a really hard question. What would you say?
I know. Well, I mean, obviously, like you said, it would be really dependent on the situation and the person. And I mean, I'm not sure how I would answer this question. And I know that in this phase of my life, I would definitely offer some of my own support. But I'm in a place where, I know I have to leverage that against what are the needs that I'm already fulfilling for myself and for other people, and what is responsible to take on. Like you said, you can't do other people's work for them, and I include self-work in that.
Right.
You can't take you. I mean, it feels so impossible for me to not absorb other people's feelings and emotions, even if they have no idea that they're feeling those things. I feel it for them. And it feels like something you can't turn off. And I don't know that I'll ever be able to. But knowing when a situation has gone on too long, that there are some people in this world who I feel genuinely don't want help. They want to stay in that place where they can feel they're really attracted to and potentially even addicted to this feeling of martyrdom.
And it serves something real, right?
Yeah. So it would depend on the situation and the person. And I think about this all the time, because what else can I really do as an individual but hold space for them? And of course, try to implement their experiences and my hopes and dreams for them into my work. But it's really challenging, because I have been there, and I found ways out, but it took a long time. But I don't know that anyone else would have advised me to do what I did, to stick with it day in and day out, to the detriment of my health. But it's difficult. It really is, because you just want to solve everyone's problems for them, so that no one has to feel the feelings that you have felt. It's difficult. So it resonates with me, everything that you shared with us, deeply.
One thing that was interesting that coincided with everything that happened at iMatter this spring was that my sister and my family experienced some pretty intense trauma. And it was, a moment where I was already doing what felt like the hardest things that I could do in this job. And then all of a sudden it's, all about family, all about, being in hospitals and getting, it was just a very, it's like one of those moments in your life that just, a switch gets flipped. And I think one of the things that's come out of that is that the people in my life who are my fiercest supporters, right? My mom, my sister, my partner, I think their rope was so much shorter because there had just been just so much trauma, and then all of the reorganizing of our lives and taking care of each other, and that everyone was thin on sleep and energy and time. And I'll say my mom and my partner in particular got so fierce with me at the end. I think they were just so tired of seeing me suffer in this place. And what a gift it's been for the two of them in particular through this horrible situation to have some of their filters removed where it was less of holding space for me and finally being like, Meg, stop.
Right.
And yeah, I just, I certainly do not believe that bad things happen for a reason. And I think an incredible gift coming out of this weird, hard, traumatic year has been, folks stepping up and being like, all right, you're not that fragile. Stop doing this. Move on. Has been a real gift, to be honest.
Yeah. Sometimes you need that push.
Yeah.
That really hard shove in the right direction.
A really hard shove.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it is one of those all of the things happened exactly as they happened. And yeah, I
Well, I
could not
know.
pull
Oh,
one.
go ahead.
I just
Sorry.
I couldn't pull one thread apart from another, right? Like everything
Yeah,
that happened with my family is not separate from how things ended at I Matter, from how things ended at the job I took after, right? So.
right. Well, I know that I'm, certainly interested and excited to see how you move about the world moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Because I just think that you have so much to offer in various spaces and just to human beings in general. Of course, within reason, not to the detriment of your health. Let's temper that. um, is there anything that you were hoping I would ask, but I did not?
I don't think so. I mean, I really, I super appreciate this opportunity and that you reached out when you did. Like I said, this isn't something that I've talked about beyond just private conversations, mostly one to one. And so I'm sure I will look back on this moment as the time where like at least these pieces started forming into whatever is going to happen next. So I really do appreciate the opportunity um, to talk with you and find maybe sort of my first footing and being able to articulate some of the things that I know aren't an isolated experience. And so this has been a real gift.
Well, I'm more than happy to hold space for you at any time. And for our listeners, I really wanted to have this conversation with Megan because I think it's so important to, one, acknowledge the fact that our systems are flawed. And of course, we see that. But to also dive into the flaws in the nonprofit system and all of these organizations that are really trying to do good work, but really taking a hard look at how we're doing that work. Are we doing that work at the expense of other people? And navigating how we are working in the world ethically and responsibly. And looking into experiences like Megan's where things break down and they're not working and why, and how Megan as one individual has been trying to navigate that. I think that's important that we all hear that story and really reflect on that. So I can speak for everyone. I think that I have that right at this moment to say that we're really grateful that you were willing to share with us this part of your story. And we acknowledge that this is the first time that you're really sharing it. And that's hard and certainly anxiety inducing. But I'm very grateful that you were brave enough and felt it was meaningful to share that, because it is not a story exactly of triumph, but in some ways that has brought you, positives in other areas of your life and how you think about your work and your responsibility as a human and a healer. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Kayla.
Well, you have a great rest of your day. And to all of our listeners, thanks for tuning in.